few formalities to start. So, Rihanna from the Students' Union representative should have read the guidelines for participation.
Sorry, it's so boring. So, in accordance with our core values, the Students' Union actively supports and promotes student participation within a safe environment at all times. The Union is committed to providing an inclusive and supportive environment without fear of racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, or any other form of discrimination. In order to achieve this, we ask that every member pay attention to their conduct and their behaviour and show respect to others when engaging in any activities hosted or supported by the Students' Union. This includes listening to another's point of view, using appropriate and respectful language at all times, and refraining from behaviour which would be perceived to be aggressive, intimidating, offensive, or discriminatory. Please remember not all disabilities are visible and that members are free to self-identify as they choose. We recognise discrimination can occur wherever it is not consciously challenged, and the aim of these guidelines is to address this. Each person is accountable for their own language and behaviour. If behaviour is observed that is not in accordance with these guidelines, members may be asked to leave by a representative of the Students' Union. We ask all members to take challenges to their behaviour seriously. If you feel these guidelines, the Students' Union's values or equal opportunities policy are being violated at any point, please raise it with the chair or the union.
Thank you. So I'm like acting as chair here, so I'll just ask you afterwards. So just say, if anyone's consistently in breach of these rules regarding bullying, intimidation of others and prevention of speech, then unfortunately we have to ask you to leave. Also, just to say that you should have a piece of paper in front of you. One of these is a Live Dem University calendar event, just have a quick look. And also there's, at the end we'll have volunteer work experience sheets just on front if you want to come along for any work experience. So that's formalities. Welcome again to the Sussex University Live Democrat Society event on drugs policy. We are pleased to have Norman Baker here as our guest speaker. Tonight, he's been a local MP for Lewis since 1997, which many of you may have recently been on his turf for the bonfire celebrations. He's been both Transport Minister and Home Office Minister in the current coalition government, until resigning from the front bench within the last month, as you may have read in the newspapers. In his role as Home Office Minister for Crime and Prevention, Norman has made great advances in tackling FGM, which is female genital mutilation, antisocial behaviour and animal experience. But more relevant to tonight, one of the most significant things Norman has done has achieved is commissioning and publishing a report on current UK drugs laws and their effectiveness. This report is a landmark event as it follows like future changes in UK drug laws can take an evidence-based approach on how to reduce harmful drug use. The publication of this report has led to the government, for the first time in over 40 years, acknowledging that tough laws on drugs do not deter people from using them. So how we're going to do this is Norman speak for 30-40 minutes before we open up the floor to questions for about 20-30 minutes. So if you've got any questions, you can hold until then. Over to Norman.
Thanks very much. If I speak at this level, can you hear me, or do you want me to use a microphone?
That's it.
Okay, I'll try and keep it up. Thanks for asking me along. And I have to say those rules about no heckling and behaviour and everything else, if you apply those in the House of Commons, there wouldn't be many MPs in the chamber at any one time, so perhaps you're better behaved than we are in Parliament. I was booked to do this while I was still a minister, so it's no connection between the fact that I had to come along here and the fact that I resigned last week, a week's a long time in politics. I don't want to go through that particularly. I'll pick up any questions at the end if you want, but as you've heard, one of my portfolio responsibilities in the Home Office for over a year was the issue of drugs and alcohol. And by the way, I want to link those two things because there is a tendency in the popular press to present drugs as something really terrible we all have to avoid and present alcohol as a bit of fun. Actually, if you look at the damage to society from alcohol, it comes to £21 billion a year. These are the official Home Office figures. £21 billion a year to the public purse. That's about 11 billion from antisocial behaviour consequences, about 4 billion to the health service, and about 7 billion from lost productivity. The total cost of to society of all illegal drugs is actually 10.7 billion, i.e. about half that of alcohol. Now, of course, alcohol is far more prevalent than illicit drugs overall, so it's not entirely a fair comparison. But it's worth pointing out that alcohol is a major problem in our society, and I think to concentrate on one at the expense of the other is simply wrong and unwise. One of the first things I did when I was a drugs minister was to go along to this clinic in South London, in Chelsea I think it was, to have a look at what I thought would be meet heroin addicts. That's what I expected to find down there. What I found down there were a few heroin addicts, but what I found mostly in there were alcoholics. And the professional NHS people in that clinic told me, in fact, it was more difficult to deal with or to wean alcoholics off their particular form of drug than it was to wean heroin addicts off heroin. So we do have to wake up in society to the problems that alcohol faces us with. And as I say, it's too often presented as something which is cuddly and nice. Now, you know, when I was a student, I was also of that mindset. So we have to just look at things realistically, I think, in those terms. So having said that, as a preliminary statement, I then want to look at the situation regarding drug use. And I would argue that what we have to do is to try to minimise the drug. This, by the way, says you should be listening to me, so if you want to leave the room, you're free to leave the room. If you want to look at the problems with drug use, we should seek, I think, as a policy objective in government, to try to minimise the harm from drug use. And the issue comes to how you achieve that. Whether or not it's achieved by adopting the approach we've adopted historically, most countries have adopted, of a kind of punitive approach, or whether in fact there's a system which is more effective at minimising the harms from drug use. And that's why I commissioned, or at least I published, it was commissioned in fact by Nick Clegg, I published the International Comparative Study. One of the reasons in fact I left the Home Office was because of the enormous difficulties I had actually publishing this civil service study into drug use, which had been commissioned along with coalition policy. The coalition had agreed to commission it, and I'm afraid my Conservative colleagues didn't like the consequences of that, because the conclusions of this study, in fact, don't bear out any support, particularly for the present arrangements we have in this country or much of the Western world. But what the International Comparative Study did was look at a range of countries across the world. It looked at, for example, at American states, Washington and Colorado, where in fact they've taken a very different approach to, say, cannabis, where this is now legal in Colorado. We've also looked at countries where there were European approaches to drugs which are different, including, for example, Holland and Belgium, and particularly Portugal, which I'll come back to in a moment. And we looked at countries, to be fair, which also had a more punitive regime, including, for example, Russia and Sweden, actually, a more punitive regime on drugs. And we looked at a whole range of issues. We looked at what the criminal sanctions were in a particular country. We looked at what the health implications were. We looked at the level of drug abuse. We looked at also what would come out of particular changes to laws which have been introduced in those countries, and whether or not that could give us a guidance to what we might do in this country. And the results from that international comparative study were quite striking. They concluded, for example, that there was no evidence that drug use in a particular country was affected either positively or negatively by how tough or soft the government's response was in that particular country. In other words, the severity of criminal penalties had little effect on drug use. So where the penalties were ratcheted up, it didn't actually lead to a decrease in drug use, nor, in fact, where they were relaxed, as they were in Portugal, did we see an explosion of drug use. Drug use appears to be, rather curiously and counterintuitively, relatively unaffected by the criminal sanctions which apply in a particular country. We did find, however, that in a country like Portugal, which has got a very interesting approach, where they've decriminalised drug use, that drug use has actually gone down. And this was not just cannabis, it was also heroin, it was crack cocaine and other drugs as well. And there we see cannabis and other drugs treated as a health issue rather than as a criminal one. Thank you very much. I've got one of those, but I'll have another one. As a criminal issue. And what the Portuguese have done has been adopted a process where they have created dissuasion commissions. So rather than someone being arrested for, say, possession of cannabis, given a warning or a caution or given a fine, or indeed in some cases in this country sent to prison, because we are still imprisoning people for possession of drugs for personal use, including, in some cases, Class C drugs, which are the least damaging, according to the government, of the various types of drugs which there are. So we will still be imprisoned for that in this country. Rather than doing that, which seems to me for political effect, they've taken a different approach. Because after all, if you're subject to a caution or a fine for possessing a small amount of cannabis, say, I would suggest that's unlikely to change your behaviour. What will change your behaviour, perhaps, is if you are persuaded that's not a good course of action to follow. And what they've done in Portugal is, rather than simply handing out fines willy-nilly indefinitely, they've taken an approach whereby they have these dissuasion commissions. And they encourage people, they don't have to go along, they can have a fine if they want to go along to these dissuasion commissions, where they learn about the consequences of drug use for themselves, what it does to your body, what it might do to your social structure, particularly if it's an addictive drug you've been using, what it might do to your family and your wider circle of friends and so on. And that's far more useful, and people are more empowered to take decisions for themselves than if they're simply treated with a range of fines for 10 minutes at a time and sent out to the police station and told to go home. And the comparison I would give you is a comparison as how we deal with speeding in this country. Because it's been traditionally the way in this country that if you're caught speeding in a car, then you're given a fine, you're given 3 points on your licence, and you maybe carry on speeding. Maybe you're slightly more careful to look out for the speed cameras, but you don't necessarily change your habits, except to try and avoid being caught. But what we've also got now in this country has been going for a while. I think the last government
Human paper is the reason.
Come on.
Hey! Human paper is the reason you're paying 9 grand tuition fees.
Don't vote for
You
this
saw
man.
them students.
Stop.
Very bad grammar. If you take the speed awareness course that we brought in this country, I think, by the last government, what they do is that when you've been caught speeding, providing you've been caught massively speeding, then you're actually taking on a speed awareness course, and you learn about what happens if you, say, hit a child going like 45 miles an hour. And you learn about these things. And it's proven to be far more effective at bringing people's speed down when they're driving than simply handing out a fine. So that's the concept of these dissuasion commissions which are operating in Portugal. And I think we have to just be honest about these things. You know, Portugal has succeeded in bringing drug use down and bringing health outcomes up as a consequence of this approach. So why wouldn't we adopt it? But it does turn on its head the way you deal with these things. You know, we have an approach where in this country drugs are handled by the Home Office. They always have been. That's the criminal department. My view is they should be handled by the Department of Health. This is a health issue predominantly, and we should look at it in those terms. Similarly, we've got a situation where the Advisory Committee on Drugs, the ACMD, is appointed by the Home Office. Indeed, you know, I appointed 1 or 2 people to it myself in my time in office. But that is also subject to political interference. And the trouble is that politicians will like to respond to public pressure, and public pressure is often what the Daily Mail and the Express says, and politicians are sometimes reluctant to do what they think is right, because they want to do what the Daily Mail says, and what the public at large therefore echoes in their statements to politicians. Now, we've taken politicians out of, for example, setting interest rates for the Bank of England. And that's absolutely right. So politicians don't fiddle around with interest rates for short-term political gain. And the economy is stronger, I think, as a consequence of that. We've taken the Home Secretary out of making decisions about whether someone should be released from a life sentence, because whatever you think about how long Myra Hindley should be in prison, there's an argument that she should be there forever. But let's say there's an argument that someone like her should have been released at some point. No Home Secretary in the world would want to take that decision because it'd be vilified in the press. So you have to leave these decisions, I think, to people who can make a judgment as to whether it's safe to release someone like that in due course after they've served a sentence. Maybe it's never right, but maybe it is, but it should be an independent assessment of that. Similarly, the Advisory Committee on Misuse of Drugs, in my view, should be the body that decides what the classification is for particular drugs. And what we saw in the last 10 years is cannabis going up and down like a yo-yo between Class B and Class C, not because the evidence had changed, but because the political pressures had changed, and the nature of the particular Home Secretary at the time, who happened to believe it should be Class B or Class C, and wanted to send out a message. So we need to take politicians out of these scientific decisions, in my view, and leave them to experts to take. What else do we find from the international comparative study? We found evidence of worse health outcomes in the Czech Republic after drug possession was criminalised, and there was no evidence of drug use reduction in the Czech Republic. Now, so it does appear to be that a health-based approach is actually successful in minimising drug use. Now, there's sometimes a confusion between the words legalisation and decriminalisation, and there are arguments for doing either of those two things, or indeed, you might argue there's an argument for keeping the status quo. Decriminalisation, just to be clear, doesn't mean that something becomes legal. It means it's no longer a criminal offence. So parking on the other line, for example, is not legal, but it's decriminalised. It's enforced by the local council. So you don't get a criminal record for it. So decriminalisation effectively takes out the criminal sanction. It does mean you're arrested by the police. It means you're taken somewhere, you're put into a health outcome process, and you're required to go through this process to the end. So it's not a soft option. In fact, the Portuguese will tell me, they did tell me, it was a harder option because people had to engage with their behaviour rather than having a 10-minute conversation with a police officer and getting a fine and walking out the station. So it's not a soft option, but it's not a criminal sanction. And I personally think it's quite wrong to give people a criminal sanction for the possession of a small amount of drugs. I don't think that's right. It can affect their lives. I deal with constituents who want to go into the medical profession and are finding it difficult because 5-10 years ago they had a criminal conviction for possession of a small amount of drugs. I've got constituents who got into the US because of a conviction a long time ago for the possession of a small amount of drugs. That's disproportionate, in my view, to what they did. So we need to be realistic about these things and not pretend it's either right or sensible to have these big impositions of penalties on people. So I say the health approach appears to me to work. So decriminalisation is not a soft option, it's a different option that pushes you into the health system rather than the criminal justice system. Legalisation, of course, is a different issue, and there are some who will argue that legalisation is right. There was, if you're interested in these matters, the last debate I had in Parliament before I resigned was actually a debate on drugs, and I presented the international comparative study. And it wasn't particularly well attended. There were about 25 MPs there from all sides of the chamber. But the interesting thing to me was all of them agreed that the present system wasn't working, and all of them, by and large, apart from one, which I have to say was Labour front bench, were happy to endorse a different approach. And there were some people there, including libertarian conservatives, I can call them that, who actually advocated legalisation. Now, why would we advocate legalisation? This is the argument, if we want to put it in these terms, that the present war on drugs, inverted commas, isn't working, that the drugs dealers are making a great deal of money. There's probably more money made from the international trade in drugs illegally than almost anything else. I think it's probably ahead of arms. Not quite sure ahead of arms, but it's certainly a close second if it's not. And third is the international wildlife trade, sadly, in endangered species. But that's where they make their money, and these people don't really care what they trade in. Don't trade in anything to make money. And what I saw at the Home Office, slight digression, was that there's a very small number of the human race who have got, frankly, no morality at all, and will do anything they can to make money, whatever the consequences for anybody else, including their own family. There aren't very many of them, unfortunately, but they do exist in the human race. And these people will deal with whatever substance they can, or whatever product they can to make money, and they're making a lot of money from drugs. It is perhaps something of a disgrace to us as a nation that we had troops in Helmand province, and there's a question mark that should have been there at all, frankly, in Afghanistan, but we had troops in Helmand province. Expressly, one of their main tasks was to eradicate the trade in opium. Actually, the trade in opium is now at record levels, so we've singularly failed to deal with that in Helmand province, and we're now seeing quite large imports of heroin into this country beyond what we've had in previous times. We know that from the street price as much as anything else. And there's now a different route for that to come in the country. It used to come across the Balkans, now it's coming round a circuitous route around Africa and up that way. So we haven't won the war on drugs. There are people making a lot of money out of the war on drugs, and there are people who are trading illegally across the world. So the argument, if you want to put it that way, I haven't bought this myself, but the argument for legalisation is if you deal with that, because you can then regulate the trade, legally, the state then controls it. The state can control the product, it can set the price, it can control the strength of whatever you're buying, and it can ensure the marketing is accurate, so you can say what you're going to do with a particular substance and what the danger might be. You can put a health warning on it if you like, to say do not have more than X amount, or this is likely to make you fall over, or whatever you want to say in your health warning. So that's the argument for legalisation, and in a sense, there is some merit in that, but of course that would also potentially have the state endorsing drug use, which no state particularly I think wants to do. It would also have the consequences of potentially expanding the number of people who access such substances. But nevertheless, there is an argument, and one of the Tory MPs in the Commons last week, I've forgotten who it was now, Peter Lilly, I think it was, in St Albans, actually made the case that he thought that drug harms could be minimised by legalising drugs. So there was a genuine debate to be had. And I don't know the outcome of that debate. I'm not someone who will say I've got all the answers. But what I would say is this: the present situation is not working, and people must be prepared to listen to the evidence and be prepared to reach difficult conclusions if that's where the evidence takes them. And one of the great frustrations for me was that I was producing and publishing this civil service report, this evidence-based report saying what's happening across the world. But a lot of people don't want to hear the evidence, because the evidence contradicts their prejudices, which they've had for many years, and which will stop them reaching a sensible conclusion on drug policy. Now, the other document which I published the same day is the report of the expert panel into new psychoactive substances, unhelpfully called legal highs. Unhelpfully because the word legal implies that they are somehow sanctioned, and they are not. Actually, what legal means, if anything, is that they've not yet been banned, which is a different proposition. And I have to tell you, my examination of the drug market leads me to conclude that new psychoactive substances, in many cases, are far more harmful and damaging than substances which have been banned for some time, and which, relatively, may be less harmful. The fact is that, and I wouldn't recommend anyone taking heroin or crack cocaine, but at least we know over a period of time what the consequences for the human body are from taking those particular substances. There's a track record over many years. So you know that if someone follows a particular course of action, this is what's likely to happen next. We have no such knowledge when it comes to many of these substances which are imported into our country, which are manufactured possibly last week in China or India in some chemical lab somewhere, and they appear in our streets. And they're dressed up in very attractive packages, a bit like sweets, quite different from how drugs used to be sold, or sometimes still are sold. Some look at the dirty back down an alleyway. This is an attractive package which looks official, which is called legal, and is on sale sometimes in places like ice cream vans. So we've got a real problem, I think, with those substances. And that's why I commissioned this expert report, to see what could be done about that. We know about some of the substances already, ketamine, for example, which has got relatively common use. That's a horse tranquilizer, and the consequence of that is, if you take too much of it, it destroys your bladder. And there are now people your age walking around with cholesterol bags for the rest of their lives as a consequence of trying ketamine. It's a very serious issue. We know other substances have similarly damaging effects as well. And what these substances by and large are, and where they come from, are from 1970s research papers which chemical companies were producing to look at potential analgesics, for example. They decided they couldn't take them very far, because what happened was that they got so far in research and found they were harmful to human health, and were discontinued. But the research papers are there, they're on the internet, and they're now being used to produce substances which by definition were not classed as safe, and are now being sold as legal highs in our country. So the recommendation from the review panel was that there should be a sort of blanket ban on these substances, with a threshold. That was the insertion I made into the review panel report, with a threshold, because actually tea is a psychoactive substance. No one suggests you should ban that, or coffee. Poppers and so on seem to exist without people being detrimentally affected. So there's got to be a threshold as to what qualifies as a dangerous substance, and there's an argument to where that threshold should be. But I'm personally convinced that there is a serious issue about those new psychoactive substances that needs to be addressed. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a landscape that's unclear, a landscape in different countries around the world, with a lot of people making a lot of money from illegal drugs, with hundreds of people dying each year in this country from illegal drug use. Not as many as die from alcohol, by the way, but dying from illegal drug use. Mostly from heroin, some from crack cocaine, 68 last year from new psychoactive substances, so-called legal highs. And it leaves us with evidence to suggest that the way we're approaching matters in this country at the moment isn't the most effective way to protect our population in terms of their health, nor is the most effective way in terms of minimising drug use in our country. So my message is the war on drugs isn't working. We need to change policy. We need to make a more health-based policy, and we need to give people more information about what there is out there, treat them as adults rather than lecturing them, and try to persuade people that a different course of action may be beneficial to them, their families, and their communities. And the last point on the communities I suppose I want to make is that this isn't simply about the individual, although it is about the individual, nor is it just about their families and their immediate circle of friends. It's also about society at large. 45% of a Christmas crime in this country is carried out by a very small number of heroin and crack cocaine users who are tied into the habit and have to find money to fund it. So a huge amount of crime is linked with particular drug use as well. So there's a societal problem. And the way you deal with those people is not by handing out a fine or putting them in prison or telling them to go off cold turkey. The way to deal with that is to give them proper treatment in a compassionate, health-based approach, and to make sure that when they are weaned off, they have a house to go to, a job to go to, family and friends to go to. That helps them, and it helps society at large. So let's actually get compassionate, let's get health-based about drug use in our country. Okay.
So we now move on to the Q&A section of the talk. Questions on all topics are welcomed, but we ask that those that are particularly relevant to this talk are allowed to be asked first, kind of thing. So just if you've got any questions on other topics, just raise your hand like in a bit, like towards the end of the section of the Q&A or middle to end.
Any drugs related, drugs or alcohol related questions?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you said you don't buy the argument for legalisation yourself. Can you perhaps elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I see there is a certain logic to it, which on the face of it looks attractive. I'm just concerned that it's a bit of a Pandora's box. You don't quite know what will happen if you went down that road, and it may be that the analysis which I've given, and other people have given, may turn out to be wrong, and if so, it'd be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, to mix metaphors. So that's my concern. I think if the world as a whole approached it, it might be easier to deal with it that way. But if one country on its own deals with it that way, you can have problems. I think Holland's found some problems as a consequence, for example, of its more modest approach towards cannabis. So that's, I think, my concern. I do think this has to be dealt with internationally, if possible. There is an UNGAS meeting, that's the UN relevant body meeting in 2016. There will be some, I think, more open discussion about these matters than for a long, long time, probably for 30, 40 years. Certainly the South American and Central American countries are more determined to have an open discussion than has been the case before, and to challenge the orthodoxy that says we must just keep a lid on everything. So let's have a discussion about it, but I think we need to be careful before we take that step, is my view. Yeah.
Hi, thanks all. I was wondering if there's any study done in the Home Office over how much of a barrier criminality of drugs is. The reason I ask that is because I can't imagine there are that many people who the only reason they don't do drugs and they want to do drugs is because they're illegal. The criminality barrier is not that strong.
No, that's exactly right. That's what this international comparative study. By the way, this is on the Home Office website, unless it's been taken up by the Home Secretary itself. The international comparative study should be there on the Home Office website, and you can see the evidence from different countries. But as I say, there is apparently no link between the criminal sanctions which apply, not even in Russia, and the level of drug use which exists. It doesn't seem to have any impact. Of course, drug levels are different in different countries, but nevertheless the increase in sanctions or decrease appears not to affect usage in those countries. So I think that's right. The people aren't, in terms of criminality generally, by the way, the evidence from the Home Office is not that people are dissuaded by the sentence. They're not, in anything actually. What they're dissuaded by, if anything, is the likelihood of being caught, which is a different proposition entirely. Yeah.
In your knowledge and experience, are there any good effects from the use of drugs on society? We always hear about the bad things, but surely it's not just a one-way trip in time.
Well, if people didn't get some benefit from it or some enjoyment, I suppose you wouldn't use them as a simplistic answer to that question. People presumably take drugs because they get some buzz from it and they feel elevated or otherwise enjoy it. I mean, that's just true for someone who uses cocaine as it does for the old lady down the street with a glass of sherry. They get something from it which changes, which alters their mind in some sort of shape or form, and that's a pleasant experience. I suppose the judgment is, what does it do to you immediately? What's it do to you in the long term or the medium term? And is that something which you can balance? And I think people, a lot of people do make those judgments themselves as to whether or not the drug they're taking, whether it's a legal drug or an illegal drug, is one which is going to be one they can absorb satisfactorily without damaging themselves. People sometimes make that calculation wrongly. If they take an addictive drug, they can find they can't stop it, although they may want to. Sometimes they make the calculation no doubt accurately to what they can and can't entail. One point about legalisation, by the way, which coming back to the previous speaker, is one argument for that is the quality argument. Because what they're doing in Uruguay, where they've actually legalised cannabis, and running it as a state enterprise now, and the same in Colorado for that matter, is they're actually controlling the strength and the quantity which is there. In Uruguay, you're allowed a certain number of pot plants with pot, as it were, pot plants, and they use radio waves to determine where those are and stop stuff coming from outside the country and so on. And that is of a particular strength, which is less strong than skunk, for example, so they control that. People who buy cocaine in this country may not like to know that most of it is now cut where it comes from rather than in this country. It used to be cut over here. It's now cut before it's imported. And 80% of it is cut with cattle dewormer. And those who think cocaine is all right may not particularly want to be ingesting cattle dewormer.
Just sort of following on from the root of that. Nick Clegg met President Santos, I think, this week, didn't he? Just off the back of you sort of coming out of your job. Santos is sort of one of the prime movers in igniting the debate on sort of global drug reform. What do they talk about, especially in light of your circumstances?
Well, I wouldn't think they talk about me particularly.
It affects policy.
Well, I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know what they talked about, but I mean, obviously that's likely to have come up, not least of all because Nick Clegg is very firm that the present situation is not working, the war on drugs is lost, and we need to change the policy. And he's very supportive of what I've been doing in terms of trying to get us in as a health-based approach, but more than that, an evidence-based approach. So I've no doubt if it was discussed, they would have discussed it on that basis. I mean, I don't know why people are so worried about the evidence. Let's have the evidence, let's have a scientist, let's analyse it, let's see what it says, and let's then try and work out what the best way forward is. People seem to be frightened of the evidence.
The counter-argument came from Conservative colleagues that drug use is going down in this country anyway.
Yes, drug use is going down. It's, as I say, it's also going down in Portugal, where it's been decriminalised, and that sort of suggests that the level of penalty, the punitive approach or the non-punitive approach, doesn't actually affect drug use. There are other factors at work. I happen to think that people of student age, by and large, are more risk averse. Is that the right way? More risk averse than my generation was. They're more careful actually with safe sex. They're more careful with alcohol, most of them. They're more careful generally. When I think about some of the stuff that my generation did, we've got Asperger's every day of the week, or we did. So I think there there is a different mindset. I think we are seeing a decline, not just in this country, but across Europe and the Western world, which is irrespective almost of the criminal sanctions or otherwise which apply. So that's an interesting sociological and generational point, but I don't think it's related to a particular level of punitive approach.
Can you understand that people will think, well, why mess with it? If it's coming down,
Well, I mean,
why take a risk?
well, first of all, it's no, by no means certain it will stay down, and what we're seeing at the moment is an increase in heroin importation, which is very worrying, I think, actually. Secondly, there's no indication that the line is an automatic one, which goes to zero. I don't really think that's the case at all. And we are still seeing significant harms. I mentioned 45% of crime being carried out by heroin and crack cocaine users. And just, crime is going down generally. It's an interesting phenomenon that crime has halved since 1995. Huge decline in crime. Now, no doubt all of us in politics like to say it's something we did that's caused that, but the answer is there's a whole lot of stuff going on we don't quite understand. So I think it'd be quite dangerous to assume that that's an inevitable consequence, inevitable trend. The drug dealers are still out there, they're still making money, and they're still pushing stuff. Yes?
What do you think of the economic effects of the previous or the current drugs policy compared with the policy we would
The economic effects of the present policy? Well, I mean, as I say, we've got a cost of 10.7 billion a year from illegal drug use. On the other hand, the cost of 21 billion from alcohol, which is legal, and there are far more deaths from alcohol and tobacco than there are from illegal drugs. So you might argue that moving towards legalisation may in fact worsen that particular picture. On the other hand, you might argue that drug use is a relatively contained issue and is unlikely to widen if it were somehow made decriminalised or legalised, even extremely legalised. And therefore, what you would do is minimise the harm from, say, the category worm or whatever else is cut with particular substances. But it's clear that there is an economic impact at the moment from particular substances more than others. The economic impact of heroin and crack cocaine use is way in excess of the economic impact to society from cannabis use or speed or amphetamine, for example. So I think it depends on the particular substances as to what the economic impact is, and they do vary. Yeah, can I go that guy there? Yeah.
Do you think the laws on alcohol should change, just going on from what you've been saying?
I think the attitude of society to alcohol should change. And it depresses me that when I dare to raise something saying, are our drug laws right? You get the Daily Mail dropping a 16-ton anvil on your head. But if you then say, actually, is it right that we should have pubs open indefinitely for the World Cup? Although, by the way, domestic violence goes up when the pubs are open during the World Cup, based on previous World Cup, then you say, oh, you're a killjoy. That's the attitude that has to change in society. I think if we do that, I have a drink like anybody else does, but you've got to be able to deal with it in moderation. Most people do, and I don't see why we should stop people having a drink if they want to drink. But what I think we should stop people doing is getting binged on a Friday night and wrecking the high street, or going out drinking after they're going to drink. So there are elements connected with drinking which have to be changed. And I think the way you do that is by changing the mindset of the population at large. Yeah.
What's the reason, do you think, why successive governments have refused to entertain the idea of changing drug policy?
Oh, very simple. It's because it's don't pick up that stone. There's something underneath it which you don't want to see. If it's not civil servicing, if you haven't got a problem in front of you, don't cause one. It's easy to just parrot the odd idea. The war on drugs is being won. Drug use is coming down. It's all working fine. Next question, please. And that's much easier to deal with than trying to actually say, well, actually, this is a better way of doing it. Because opening up a hornet's nest, because that's how it's seen, is a danger. And it's often the way politicians, they don't want to have a question asked which opens up a potential problem. They'd rather just pretend it's okay. So, where I've offended against my political class is by asking these questions, which people don't generally do. And plus the fact that there are certain beliefs out there in the public which are pushed by the papers in particular, which happen to be wrong. And it's difficult then to challenge an idea which you know to be wrong if it's A, complicated to explain why it's wrong, and B, you're going to get hammered for saying it's wrong. And drug use is one of those. Prison is another one. You know, prison is used far, in my view, far too much to lock people up for minor offences. It doesn't work. You know, they learn how to commit new offences. If you're looking at drug use, you know, where's the place you can get drugs, store drugs? In prison. You know, we can't even keep drugs out of prison, let alone society as a whole. And people go into prison clean and come out with a drug habit. And yet we're told that prison works. So, you know, challenging these things, or when a Daily Mail and Daily Express say you can lock people up, increase sentences, etc., it's quite hard. Yeah.
Obviously, you know, I think that you've been a great minister and would be a fantastic minister under a Labour-led government. But do you feel let down that you've had to sacrifice a big political reputation for voting for disgusting Tory policies, and yet Theresa May won't even listen to your report? And also, just because Nick Clegg says that we want to get rid of sentences for drugs, how do we know he won't treble it when he comes, if he were to come in as a Deputy Prime Minister next year?
Well, that's a slightly obscure question, but I know where you're coming from. Look, I mean, you just do what you can in politics. You know, you have to deal. This applies to the whole question you was asked, actually. And thanks for the nice comment at the beginning, although it was slightly advanced later on. You have to just deal with the hand you've got. You know, when you're playing cards, you get dealt out the cards. How best to deal with those? How can you maximise what you want to do in terms of changing society for the way you want to make it look with a hand you've been dealt? And sometimes the hand you've been dealt is 4 kings and 4 aces. You just get on with it and say, right, you know, I'm going to do that. Sometimes you dealt with a pretty rotten hand, and you have to say, well, how can I make this work? How can I bluff here? You know, what can I do? Can I change out for a pair of 8s? Or, you know, what happens to be a metaphorical term. So, you know, the position is that, you know, we are the minor party in the coalition. I mean, we can't get it. We've got a lot through. 75% of the manifesto has been delivered, as a matter of fact, which you won't read about in most of the papers, but it has been. But also, we've had to compromise on some other stuff. But so the Tories, you know, that's the nature of coalition. You know, they wanted to do all sorts of things like tax breaks for their rich friends. They wanted to ban, they wanted to be able to people to be fired at will. That's one of the things they wanted to do. We stopped that. So there's a whole lot of stuff we've stopped, as well as stuff we've actually done. But they've stopped stuff we want to do. That's the nature of coalition. So, you know, I think when it comes to the next manifesto, because we had our fingers burnt last time, we've been out of power for 90 years, a bit naive about things, you know, we will be very clear what is a red line and what's not a red line, and that will be the way we'll approach things. Yeah. By the way, I should just say that the Labour Party is probably more right-wing than the Tory Party in Home Affairs matters, which may surprise you, but it's actually sadly true.
Okay, so you spoke of mandatory health-based intervention in the case of possession, but how do you actually distinguish between someone who's in possession of a drug and someone who actually has a medical, like health-based problem with it and needs treatment? Because if possession is enough to send you into treatment, then you know, your argument retains the core conception that people should never do drugs, and that the state always has a paternalistic right to intervene despite individual sovereignty, despite the strain that would put on the healthcare system. Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that drugs are wrong in all circumstances, or just certain circumstances?
Well, I'm glad you raised the medicinal issue, because I wanted to pick that up and then forgotten about it, so thank you for the prompt. First of all, there's a major problem in our society with the abuse of prescribed drugs. Drugs which are officially there from the NHS. There's a problem with people who divert them illegally, including in prisons, but there's also a problem with people who are over-prescribed stuff. They shouldn't be prescribed. And we've seen, you know, all sorts of issues with particular substances which have had to be controlled subsequently when they've had a huge number of prescriptions issued by the NHS. And of course, let's also remember the NHS uses drugs which have been made illegal for medicinal purposes. You could use opiates in hospitals quite regularly, and morphine and so on are used quite regularly. We wouldn't get them on the street. So it's perfectly possible to have a substance which has got a specific medicinal use, which is controlled in particular circumstances, and one which is not available for general recreational use. That division already exists. And I would like to see that taken further by looking again at illegal substances to find out whether they have got legitimate uses. And one of the most powerful things I've found in my year as drugs minister, a year and a bit, was the case put before medicinal use of cannabis. And I had people come to me, very credible people, in my view, from all walks of life, on a regular basis, including some from Brighton, as a matter of fact, who came to me and said, I've got this condition, and I've sourced cannabis illegally to help me with it. It does help me with it, lets me carry on my life. Nothing else being given to me works. The prescriptions don't work, or they have all sorts of unwanted side effects. I've even had people who were prescribed opiates who actually wanted cannabis, but they couldn't get cannabis. And they've said to me, these people, how can it be that I'm not only prevented from accessing something useful to help me with my health condition, but I'm made a criminal when I do so? That cannot be right. And that's why I've asked the Department of Health, I wrote formally to the Health Secretary to say, you've got to look at this again. You've got to look at the medicinal uses, which other countries have done. There are recognised medicinal uses in other countries for cannabis, for example. There's also, even in this country, we've got something called Sativex, which is a cannabis-based product which is available on the NHS, so very difficult to get hold of. And I've got letters here, not with me actually, to look at them. These letters here from members of the public, which have come to my office in the last couple of weeks, these are from people who say, these aren't about legalising drug trafficking, these are about people who say, I've got a health problem and I want to use cannabis and I'll stop from doing it. That's what these people say. So we've got to actually have a bit more of a compassionate approach to these things. So I hope that answers your question, but my view is that, yes, there are legitimate uses for drugs, we should encourage those, but we shouldn't then automatically assume that because of the medicinal use, that means it should be recreational use as well.
My question was fairly centred on recreational use, I think.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood it.
That's okay, but as well as that, I mean, the paper International Drug Comparators actually said that cannabis being in Schedule 1 is reflective of the fact that there's not enough evidence for the medical benefit, but you just stated that there is.
Well, there is.
Evidence for the medical benefit, but it's your paper.
If in my view, it was put in Schedule 1 as a kind of overreaction in 1971 when the Misuse of Drugs Act was introduced. There is a medicinal use because we've actually got a product here in the UK formally approved by the Department of Health called Sativex. So even the Department of Health recognises a medicinal use for it for particular circumstances. There's lots of anecdotal evidence from people in this country who say it helps them. And there are other countries, including the Low Countries, who've actually identified further conditions, whether it's epilepsy, MS or anything else, where they say cannabis is effective and where it's actually available for those conditions. So the evidence both in this country and elsewhere suggests there are medicinal uses, and the Schedule 1 definition or allocation is completely wrong. We've not had a question here.
First of all, I'd like to say I agree with your medical-based approach for sort of heroin and substances like that. But when it comes to cannabis, what would your argument be for not just fully legalising it when you consider that so many more people sort of die and act violent and stuff like that on alcohol than on cannabis, and try not to sort of use them more people do use alcohol sort of argument?
Well, I mean, you're right about the number of deaths, and I remember when I was in opposition, I asked a parliamentary question as to how many people died in a year from alcohol abuse, from tobacco and from cannabis. I can't remember the figures exactly, so please, if I'm getting this wrong from memory, excuse me, but I think roughly it was 50,000 people a year from tobacco, 20,000 people a year from alcohol, and 5,005 from cannabis. So, I mean, there's certainly that sort of scale of things. The answer is, I think we've now got, the answer is, a pragmatic answer, is there are experiments going on around the world now, just started in the last couple of years, in Uruguay, in Colorado, in Washington State, and elsewhere. And I think probably what we ought to do is, and in fact this says so in here, which caused the Home Secretary some palpitations, we've got to keep an eye on those and see whether or not they apply to this country. So I think the sensible answer is
to future legalisation.
Well, I think we should not rule it out. We should look at where we are when we see how the experiments bed down in other countries. I've got about 5 minutes more, I think. So who's not had a question? Go right at the back.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you have to say on maybe problematic drug users, because most problematic drug users tend to be poor people, people who suffer from poverty, and in your position in the coalition, do the coalition policies not promote poverty and stagnation of wages, reduction of social mobility? So is the idea about the war on drugs not necessarily just about drugs themselves, but about the way society sees itself? Because even if you legalise drugs, you're going to have these problematic drug users who find themselves in sort of situations.
Well, I mean, I think 2 things about that quickly. One is that I don't think that it's right to assume that drug use is necessarily associated with people who are either socially inadequate or poor.
That's not what I claim.
I'm sorry, I think you did.
Problematic drug use is associated with people, I think drug use across all classes tends to be roughly the same, but most addiction is housed in the lower class.
Yes, yes. I think a great deal of drug use is, in fact, if you're saying that, then I think I agree with you. A lot of drug use is carried out by people who are quite wealthy, or at least well off and comfortable, and are able to carry on their lives without effect. And I can think of people in very senior positions who have what the papers would call a drug habit, actually use drugs recreationally. So that is a factor, and that's one of the reasons why I think society is changing its attitude, that people do believe that certain levels of drug use of certain drugs can be accommodated with a lifestyle. That's a general now more common belief than it was. And that's why I think when I produced this drug report, I got support with a lot of sides of the Commons, all MPs bar one who spoke in favour of roughly changing things, and why the papers, even the papers, really were quite muted about it. It's quite a positive response. I think people's attitudes are changing, and I think the attitude of the population at large is probably ahead of what politicians say, if not ahead of what they're thinking. Yeah.
You mentioned a more health-based approach to looking at drugs policy. What role would the NHS play in that?
Well, a crucial role, because the NHS, I think, is seen as a trusted friend. It's seen as a body which is capable of trying to work out what's best for individuals in terms of their health outcomes. People trust the NHS quite rightly. It's a great organisation we've got in our country. And I think if the NHS were to say dispassionately, this is what we think is the best way of dealing with this particular person in the interest of themselves and their health, people are likely to believe that. So I think the NHS has got a major role, actually, in taking forward people who particularly want to deal with their drug use. Not everybody does want to deal with their drug use, but some people do. And the NHS is the body, I think, compassionately and effectively to deal with it. Yeah.
Do you think there would ever be a situation where it would be appropriate for somebody to face criminal sanctions in drug use?
I think it's very appropriate to use criminal sanctions for dealing in drugs, which is absolutely the right thing, because people who deal in drugs are often there just to make money for themselves, irrespective of the consequences for anybody else. So I think we should actually free up resources which are presently being wasted, in my view, on small levels of possession, and use those resources to deal with people who are making money out of people's misery. So that's what I would do with that, and I would be quite hard on that. We need to reinforce the National Crime Agency and our international connection to make sure we understand the international trade in drugs, which is actually what we have to do to crack it. Once stuff comes into the country, it's much more difficult. Getting the intelligence of what's happening around the world is actually the key to that. So better international relations with other countries to try and deal with this is actually where I want to put the money. And I want to be very hard on those people who are just simply making money out of someone else's misery. In terms of drug use itself, no, I don't think we should be criminalising that, no matter what it is. You know, if someone's using a huge amount of drugs, which is causing damage to them, that's a health problem. I'm sorry for them. You know, let's try and help them.
So it's about 7 o'clock now. If we just take one more question.
Right, the guy with the blue there.
Just to ask briefly on another subject, did you resign as Home Office Minister in order to retain the seat in Lewis, which you're hemorrhaging votes to Conservatives and Greens?
I'm not hemorrhaging votes in terms of Greens, we lost the post last time. But what I would say is that any analysis of that doesn't stand up, I'm happy to say. It doesn't stand up for the following reasons. One is that the majority is actually quite large at the moment, it's 7,500, 8,000. Secondly, this has always been a Lib Dem or a Tory seat, Lewis, and therefore by definition, by resigning and making nasty noises about the Conservative Party, it's likely to alienate those people who are Conservatives who vote for me in large numbers, far larger numbers than people who are Green or Labour do. So, strange as it may seem, I resign as a matter of principle.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it and found better insight into drugs and drugs policy and how it's dealt with in politics. We just got the Lewis Lib Dem organised just to say a few words about work experience if anyone's got any work experience.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloe. I am the campaigns organiser for the Democrats. While I do understand most of you are here to listen to Norman and about drugs policy, obviously I'm sure you all know there's a general election next year. Here in Lewis we're not only trying to get Norman re-elected, but we also have local elections. There'll be something like 100 people looking to get elected. And of course, can't get anyone elected unless we talk to voters and we have volunteers to come and help us out. So if you are interested in coming to volunteer in Lewis, it'd be a brilliant opportunity to help in a general election campaign. You won't just be delivering leaflets, you will be doing lots of interesting things. You can get a good reference from us, meet a whole load of new people, make a good social thing. I've got some forms here. It's pretty simple, just name, email address. Please come and put yourself down. I'll get in contact with you very, very soon.
And just to say about the Nuclear Society, we meet every week on Thursday at 7, so this time, but it's in Portland Hall 1. Next week we're having pizza and politics, and pie. The pizza's free, and the topic is how green are the Lib Dems, so come along to that if you want to. And you do not have to be a Lib Dem to do the volunteer experience or come to the Uni Society, because we like a broad range of topics and opinions, so good old vibrant discussion, that's really good. So, but thanks for coming.
That's the pizza.
That's the pizza.
The thing is, we'll have to go to the radio.
Do you want a picture? No.